Hey everybody, still not completely recovered from this dang cold, but can't gold brick it forever, old expression. Well, that's part of the reason I haven't put any more quizzes online or anything, because we just haven't gotten through the material. We're about a week behind, and I actually did originally put an extra week in our schedule, but I didn't expect I would use it until much later in the semester. So we're starting chapter 5, still talking about population and whatnot. Try to get through everything today in this chapter, but I might not be able to, so we'll just see how it goes. Any general questions about anything before I just start talking about migration stuff? Okay, so I'm not going to bore the objectives. So mobility, this chapter is all about mobility, and of course, in geography, kind of all the chapters will talk about mobility to some extent, but this one kind of focuses on it, lots of key terms and whatnot. Obviously, humans are very mobile. From our entire existence and our history, we've been very mobile, moving around a lot for all kinds of reasons, short-term reasons, long-term reasons. So some key terms, well, obviously, although there's a lot of talk about immigration, right, movement into a country, there's a lot of people who move out of countries. One of the examples from the textbook is, well, way back during the colonial era, Britain had control of this whole section of South Asia. And when colonialism was wrapping up, basically in a nutshell, after the Second World War, England not only didn't have the power to kind of hold its colonies anymore, it didn't really have the will to do it as much. And so before it did that, it decided to split up the territories that it had into two countries. I know it looks like it's more than two countries. It is now. At the time, and this will sound as dumb as it was, but they said, okay, well, they had a number of geographers look at some demographics on maps. These are kind of famously bad in the field of geography, is much discussed. But these geographers basically said, well, it seems like this area and this area are Islamic, and this area is Hindu, so we're just gonna say that this is India, its own country. And then we're going to decide, since these are both Islamic, we're going to decide they're one country, East and West Pakistan. And you can see that they're separated by a huge amount of land. They're also just culturally extremely different, right? It doesn't make any sense. It's like if you're going to decide that New York and California are one state and they need to somehow coordinate everything together, it literally doesn't make any sense, right? Well, when this happened, historically, populations who are a minority of a population are often persecuted, unfortunately. This is just like a historical fact. So when these borders went in, anybody who was in these countries who didn't have the majority religion suddenly fled for the other country. And so you have millions of people who overnight were attempting to go and cross borders. And in this process, well, there were communities who would have a whole bunch of people coming through their community, and they would decide they're invaders, and there was giant massacres, and it was absolute mayhem and chaos, right? And it was all because some lines were drawn on a map. Now, of course, much later, these countries were separated out. It didn't really make sense to have an East and West Pakistan, so now we have what's Bangladesh, still called Pakistan, on the other side. But that's... The book doesn't kind of go into that too much. It just says this is a lot of migration for a while. But that's why, and that's the kind of political chaos that sometimes happens that causes large waves of migration. If within a country the political laws have all of a sudden changed, who is the majority changes, something like that. Immigrants by host country, this is 2017. And as you look at this, you might see a number of patterns that you would expect. I would say people are very often surprised by how much immigrant population are in Saudi Arabia. Well, Saudi Arabia has well, most of their workforce are from other countries because most of the people who are Saudi Arabian have some amount of wealth from that oil wealth. When Saudi Arabia decolonized and it took control of its oil resources, it basically is a very simplified version of it, but they made a deal that anyone who could prove their heritage to before when oil was basically discovered could then get a percentage. Anyone else who came later usually is still not considered a citizen, even if they've been there for generations at this point. You have a very large population, and because they're not citizens, there's all kinds of things like workers' rights that they don't have. They're basically, well, what are called guest workers, right? A lot of countries have guest workers. A guest worker means you're allowed into a country because the country might have decided that they have not enough people in some type of employment sector. And so they'll say, well, you can come in here to work, but don't make yourself comfortable because you're going to be kicked out. But that's in a nutshell what a guest worker is. Excuse me. General laws of migration, although these came out with a long time ago, these are still generally accepted as laws of migration. Typically, well, the majority is over a short distance, just because long distance migration tends to be quite a bit burden. Tend to be in steps. Very often, again, a long journey is a burden. If you have a small step in your migration, well, in each step, you're more likely to kind of be able to have contacts and people that you know. Long distance migrants, although it does happen, move to places of economic opportunity. The majority of people moving around are looking for economic opportunity. They're looking for good work. Every migration generates a movement in the opposite direction or a counterflow. Very often this is populations who maybe they're guest workers and their time is up and they have to go back. Or sometimes they just want to go visit where they came from, things like that. Sometimes it's the next generation even that decides to kind of check out the country that they came from. The U.S. and Minnesota itself has had lots of migration waves. A lot of it depended on the transportation of the different eras. A lot of the first kind of waves of European migrants came up on the steamships, later on rail transit. Early migrant into Minnesota. Some more laws of migration. People in rural areas migrate more than people in cities. That's because, well, that's where the jobs are in cities, and since most people are migrating for work, it makes more sense to move away from a place where wages are going down and toward a place where wages are going up. Males migrate over longer distances than females. Most migrants are young adult males. Very often what you'll have a situation where maybe a young male member of a family will go to a country that maybe they've heard good things about, kind of go and check it out, and if it's some place that he thinks the family would come later, then you have chain migration where it's like, okay, I'll have some more of my relatives come and they'll kind of set up and see if there's a community locally that they could kind of work with. Cities grow more by migration than natural increase, and we actually learned that a lot in the last chapters, looking at increase and birth rates. And in general, cities are pretty stable. People in cities tend to not have a ton of kids. The growth of cities that we've seen is people moving into them, usually looking for work. Again, migration increases with economic development. Migration is mostly due to economic factors. A number of those are kind of a little repetitive, redundant. Also, a lot of the first people, migration that came in for jobs in Minnesota here was the lumber industry, back when we were covered in trees. As you could see, we're no longer so covered in trees. Again, holding to the example of Minnesota, as you can see through different decades, historically, different ethnic groups would kind of come in different amounts in their migrations. You can see there's one decade where there's a very large amount of Swedish immigrants who came to our state. But again, you see ups and downs. You see in general, this is a Northern European trend. But also we get a lot of immigration from neighboring states, right? That's that law that the closer tends to have more immigration, further away has less. And this migration had a geography to it. Immigrants still today often will settle in ethnic enclaves in areas where there are people who are from the same country, so that for a while they can use the language that they're used to and take some time to assimilate. And assimilation happens in different patterns and at different rates. So for example, well, the German population in the US, German is, people are often surprised, but it's the largest ethnicity in the US are people of German heritage, but we had a couple of world wars that made it so that they were very interested in assimilating completely and quickly. And so they all became Americanized, right? This is a chart from the book looking at Swedish, immigration and immigration. Well, you can see we have kind of a repeat of that chart I showed you looking at Minnesota and places where when Sweden was people were mostly moving out of Sweden. You can see that changed a lot through time, especially as Sweden developed, as its economy grew. It became more of a pull factor for people to move into. And our book especially talks about most recently with a lot of immigration, from Syria, right? From Syria, mostly due to war and conflict. Well, this chapter, like I said, it does talk a lot about Syria and the conflict, but I don't know if it goes into a great detail about why. I feel like we probably talk about the Arab Spring more in a later chapter, but in a nutshell, do people know of the Arab Spring? They've heard this phrase, they know what this means? Not really. Well, now it's been quite a while, I guess. Well, in a nutshell, it's called the Arab Spring because across a great variety of Arab nations, when they first kind of fought off their colonial rulers, they often had like a strong man who was maybe the general of the army or something like that, and they often declared themselves the leader. And usually they would say something along the lines of, well, this is just an emergency time because we just got our independence from that colonial power, so we need a strong man in power just for a while, just to get things organized, and then we'll go back to we'll have democracy and everything just like other developed countries. But what happened was those rulers just kind of kept that power for 30 or 40 years, right? Huge amounts of time went by. And then, well, there was a certain fellow in Tunisia who the police and whatnot had been kind of running him around a lot, and he was very frustrated with the local government. So he went into a public square and set himself on fire. People shared this on social media, and they shared his story about what his complaints were, and they all basically talked about how they also were facing the same problems in the countries that they were from, where the government was completely unresponsive to them. The government was, if anything, the enemy. And so you had a series of demonstrations, and a whole bunch of countries had revolutions. And at the time, this seemed like in general a very positive thing because these were dictatorships that had been around for a long time. I was in Egypt 2 weeks before they had their revolution, and people on the streets and whatnot, they were talking about how very dissatisfied they were having, well, a dictator as the president of their country. Well, countries had these revolutions. Well, to stick on the example of Egypt for a minute, in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, he was the president. He'd been saying for a long time that he was going to transition the country to democracy, but it seemed pretty clear that he was setting up his sons to take over, and that's part of the reason why these places had revolutions, is their attitude was, you've been saying we're going to have a democracy, we fought off these colonial rulers that were monarchies because we decided that was not a right way to rule, but now we're just going to be a monarchy, just like the countries that we fought for our freedoms from. Well, in Syria, the younger generation had actually fully transitioned to power before the revolution happened. And so because the younger generation was in power, well, the civil war just did not work there. There was a major conflict, and actually, well, the Syrians hired a lot of Russian mercenaries, and a lot of the things that Russia is doing today in Ukraine, they tested out in lots of other countries for a lot of money. And so Syria basically called in a bunch of hired guns, and so people fled. So if you look at the displacement of populations, our article talks about, our book is talking about Sweden quite a bit, so it carries on this info about how, although you could see in total people, Sweden did not take the most immigrants, but Sweden is a country that actually doesn't have a lot of people, so per capita, they took in the most immigrants compared to any place else. But you could see relatively neighboring countries, and this is normally what happens if you have a immigrant crisis because you have a war or something. It's countries that are closest that everyone is able to kind of get to most easily, and then the furthest away is usually the more difficult. Kind of depends on the country and whatnot. But this was kind of, well, at the point that this book was published, they didn't have info about the most recent stuff going on in Ukraine, so this was the biggest immigrant crisis at the time frame. So as you can see in the US, the immigration by continent has changed a lot through time. There's been lots of changes to the laws through time for lots of different reasons. For a while, there was laws that were saying that immigration was only allowed in the percentages of the people who were already had immigrated. I know that sounds very convoluted because it was. And so that meant that mostly only Europeans were let in. As you can see, Great Depression, immigration was cut off quite a bit because people had to worry about not having enough jobs for a population who already lived here. And then shortly after that, there was large World War II, big conflict and whatnot. You can see we didn't have another large immigration wave until quite a bit later, peaking in the what looks like 80s and 90s, right? And it looks like for the most part, it's been going down for a while since then. But you can see it's different contingent, different component. All right. Push and pull factors. I would say, I don't know why, but often people get these confused, but I feel like they're pretty clearly different things. Push factor, right? So if you have a war in your country, right, something bad is happening, that is a push factor. That's going to make you leave. That doesn't decide where you go, though. Where you go depends on the pull factors. Well, where can you go? Are there places that will accept immigrants? Are there places that are a better place and not a worse place to move to, right? There's all kinds of things that are pull factors. And a lot of this is actually, well, in our book it says technology, broadcasts, push and pull factors. People, worldwide when they come to the U.S., a lot of that reasoning is from what they see on TV and movies, right? What they see the U.S. as being like. And often when they get there, it can be quite different than what they expected. Types of push and pull factors. I'm not going to go through every single one of these. I'll go through some specifics. In our book, it talks about using an example of a Chinese student who comes to the U.S. to get their degree, and then they need to decide when they finish their degree they're going to stay in the U.S. or are they going to go back, right? And there's lots of different things. Very often, a lot of the aspects of wanting to leave the U.S. is, maybe if you never really kind of connected with people in the U.S., right? You didn't make too many friends. You don't feel like it's the right moment to be in the U.S. Maybe the economy isn't doing as well as you had thought. Maybe you're experiencing a lot of negative things in the US. Factors to pull people back to China. Very often, again, like, you have, if you didn't make any friend networks here, but you still have them where you came from, you might prefer to go back. There might be an aspect of patriotism. There's something called brain drain. Brain drain is, well, it's when you have people who have good educations, but they're moving away from countries that they're from and moving toward other countries. And so a classic example is, if you go see the doctor, very often there'll be people from different countries. And part of the reason is that, you could get paid 10 times as much as a doctor in the US compared to lots of other countries. But a lot of people have to they have to question, what if they got their education, became a doctor in the other country? Well, do they want to give back to that community? Do they want to give to the community they came from? Or, you could move to a place where you get much larger wage and you could send money back home to support your family as remittances, and that could be an amount larger than you would have made at home. So maybe actually benefiting your family at home more for you to stay here as opposed to going back, right? There's all kinds of things. Obstacles to migration. These are lots of different things, right? Lots of things that could stop. Very often, it could just be the political winds of the country, right? Who's the elected leader of the country that you want to move into? Have they put up new laws? Is there stigma? Is there things like that? And of course, there's just friction of distance, meaning, it's difficult to travel very large amounts of space. It's easier to migrate to a place that's right next door, right? So voluntary migration, we've actually talked a bit about this already. I mentioned chain migration, somewhat. That is, what it sounds like if you have kind of connecting groups and communities that can kind of help you move to some place. It's still a slower process. It has individual steps, often kinship links. Like I said, you could often have maybe a young male of a family go into a place, decide if that's a place that is good for the family, and they could bring family members. I will say again, though, rural to urban migration, that's the main trend, right? That is a trend that's been happening in the US. It's been happening for over 100 years. Ever since industrialization, people have been moving to cities and moving out of rural areas because economies and incomes in rural areas in general have been going down. As the rest of the world also industrializes, they're going through the same thing that we have. Some data from our book, just looking at ratios and numbers of people who are displaced by natural disasters. It's quite a bit, but it's nothing compared to people who are moving for economic opportunities, right? But it's still, there's plenty of this happening. Transnational migration, internal migration. Well, these are all obviously what the terms sound like. Let me think if there's anything that's counterintuitive to any of these. Most migration is internal, partially because it's so easy. So in the US, an average person moves once every 3 years, right? So it's like in the US, we're moving all the time. Usually it's for job opportunities, right? It's like, and it's easier to move within the US, obviously. If you have a job opportunity and it's on their side of the planet, right? Completely different culture, different economy, whatever else. It's like, should I move there? Or I could move to a neighboring state, right? Where things are kind of basically the same as they were. And so I won't really have difficulties kind of figuring everything out. One of the many examples our book talks about is the Great Migration, Great Migration. This was basically African Americans in the South moving to the North. And there were aspects of the Great Migration that were similar to regular migration that we're talking about, where it was a lot of rural occupations, right? A lot of these rural occupations were extremely low paid, and populations Well, there was huge demand in northern cities that were industrializing because they needed factory workers, right? They had shortages. They needed workers. And so it was one of those things where it's like, well, why wouldn't you move where you could get paid more? And as you can see, well, specific states went to specific other states. This is often because you would have not just rivers that went along these pathways, but rail lines, right? A lot of this was by rail. And so very often the populations moved just directly north. Our book also talks about with migration, you tend to get a mixture of cultures coming together, right? And so that's why also shortly after the Great Migration, there was an explosion of new music in these northern cities, right? And it was African Americans who were moving up and kind of mixing music from the South with music and new technology, right? Electric blues and whatnot, that was all in the North, right? This is a very common thing actually you get with waves of migration is you get innovations, you get new ways of thinking because you have people with very different perspectives who come together and they get all kinds of new ideas for things. They have innovations. I went online and just like looked up some pictures of the Great Migration. Excuse me. See the work in the South, agricultural, very difficult working conditions. Northern cities had a lot of things that southern cities didn't have. The organized segregation that was in the South, although obviously in the North there were still people who would be racist and whatnot. But African Americans who moved to the North were more able to open up their own businesses. The schools had more money. I would say rural southern schools had like near zero budget. Right? Northern cities, especially governments, were started hiring African Americans, whereas in the South, the governments, in the state governments, just would not, right? So economic opportunities. Even the ability to be able to like protest and not have dogs set on you, that was more of a thing you could do in northern cities, right? And so when we talk about push-pull factors, well, bad economy and lots of rights you don't have in the South, as opposed to the North where things weren't ideal, things weren't perfect, but they were better opportunities. I already talked about guest workers quite a bit. And actually we'll talk about this quite a bit when we get to our chapter on agriculture. But in a nutshell, you know, people who have seasonal herds, they move with the herds, move with the seasons. Circular migration, I think of a good example of this. I would say workers who are maybe seasonal workers, right? And so they'll move to a place when it's a harvest season, and so they'll help out and get some good wages. But then once the harvest is done, like the work is done, right? And actually, many of the first Hispanic immigrants into Minnesota were seasonal workers who found other opportunities when it was not seasonal. And that was actually the very first kind of immigration within specifically Minnesota. And those communities built from there. I would say Minnesota's economy has always been pretty good compared to a lot of other states and countries. I would say another example, just to throw it out there, is like the cruise lines. One of the countries that has the most workers who work abroad is the Philippines. And many people will work in the cruise industry, and what they'll do is while at home they'll have a harvest season and whatnot that they'll stay there for, and then half the year they'll work on cruise ships just making cash, and they often just send that home to support their family for like maybe half the year. Different things like that are circular migration. Again, some more data from our textbook looking at countries that have had refugee crisis, displaced. When you look at the map, you can see a fair percentage of it is due to different conflicts, different wars. Sometimes it's due to just the political collapse of a country, right? Colombia's been having some especially difficult times. I would say, well, this is 2017. More recently, Venezuela has actually been having a lot of political times, tough times and turmoil. So this is kind of a changing map. Forced migration. Forced migration is, well, it just sounds like you don't really have an option to not migrate, right? Very often this could be if your country is having a large war. It's like you can't not move if your house has been blown up, right? People will often, well, call people refugees. Sometimes if it's a political reason, something that's happening maybe in their home country. I would say in Syria, a lot of the population were political refugees because they came from ethnic groups that weren't part of the ruling majority. And so, well, to stick, since we talked about Syria quite a bit already, there's a large Kurdish population in Syria, and they're a big part of the revolution to try to overthrow their dictator, and it failed. It did not work. And so, well, they were just being murdered and killed off, right? And so they applied for political asylum in many different countries, and plenty of countries just say no, and some countries say yes. Well, when it comes to forced migration, there's also, of course, human trafficking, still an unfortunate part of our modern world, still on news headlines pretty regularly. When people are abducted or forced, coerced to move. Causes of forced human migration. Well, I actually already mentioned all these, I think. Didn't really mention natural disaster. It's definitely a thing that happens. I would say percentage of total people who migrate, it's pretty small total percentage. Famine, human trafficking. Again, these are forced migration, right? You don't have a choice. How do we do on time? Doing okay with time. Oh, when it comes to migration experiences, well, things can really just kind of depend on the timing and whatnot. I don't know if people know much about a large ethnicity in Minnesota here, the Hmong population. Do people know much about the Hmong population and the history of why they came to Minnesota or anything?
A lot of them migrated from Laos.
Yeah. But why Minnesota? The weather? People know about the history of the Hmong in Vietnam and that area? Well, I'll give you a quick summary. People have seen the movies, right? Know there was a war in Vietnam. The U.S. was there. Well, one of the allies in the war was the Hmong. The Hmong were a persecuted minority in Vietnam, and they also lived in a number of neighboring countries. And well, they were part of the Allies because they were trying to basically fight for their own independence and whatnot. Well, the U.S. was in Vietnam for a good number of years, and at a certain point, basically decided to pull up and just leave. And a lot of the population who were our allies, we just said goodbye to. And many of them were like, well, can you help us or protect us or anything? And the U.S. just kind of said, nah. That population then after the U.S. was hunted down. There's a documentary called Hunted Like Animals, and there was forced assimilation of the populations. A lot of the Hmong were forced to marry into the other ethnicities of the region and to drop their language, drop their customs, and fully assimilate into those other cultures. It wasn't until many years later that Walter Mondale, local politician. I don't know if people know about Mondale very much. He ran against Ronald Reagan for president in 1984 and only won one state. You can probably guess which state that was. That was Minnesota. Well, even though he did not win the presidency, he was still locally a very popular politician, and he'd actually fought for many years for the U.S. to allow the Hmong to immigrate in, since they were being killed in their own country and they were being killed for being our allies. It took a long time, but eventually, yes, that laws were passed, and specifically in Minnesota, were allowed. Some local laws were able to allow even more of the population, and so much of the first waves of the Hmong population who immigrated into the U.S. came to Minnesota. Now, since there's been kind of a lot that have moved to California as well, can't blame. It's like California weather compared to Minnesota. But as you all probably know, we still have a very large Hmong population locally, and it's again because of political whims, and it's because, well, one politician felt that it was wrong that we had left them. I would say a story like that exists for just about every ethnicity that there is, right, that has immigrant populations. It's different things like that. Environmental effects on migration populations, well, various climate disasters. Don't need to go through the list of climate disasters. Oh, there is a picture in our book that says it's from St. Paul. I can't quite identify it, but it uses this picture as an example of our changing immigrant groups, right? This is a group of Somalis. Well, historically, when I showed you the graph showing the different groups that have migrated in through time, like I said before, it kind of depends on laws at different times. I would say when countries have bad economies, very often they'll put in laws to restrict immigration. When they have good economies and unemployment rate is very low, and especially if, for example, there's certain skills gaps, if there's certain jobs that are high in demand and there's just not local people to do it, then places will kind of loosen up and allow immigrants who fill those specific gaps in the labor market, right? I would say, in general, just to look at Europe instead of the US as the constant example, in general in Europe, Southern Europe has tended to have not as good of an economy as Northern Europe. And then when it comes to immigration, well, it's easier for people to migrate into Southern Europe, but they're much less accepting and they're worried about people taking their jobs, right? But once populations, if they can get through and get to Northern European countries, they're able to find much more success and more acceptance, but it's just much more difficult to get because you got to go through all these other countries first, right? All right. Actually, I already looked at that map. I think I already talked about most of these. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything. Skills gap, we talked about that. Remittances, that's the money that you send back to your home. Brain drain, talked about that a bit. Yeah, I talked about a lot of these things already. Graph is not so great. Cultural and social effects of migration. Well, already mentioned this a bit. Usually we find if you have immigrants coming into an area, well, if an area is static and its population doesn't change up, well, its economy and its culture can just kind of be static and kind of just not have much going on, put it that way, right? Historically, if you have immigrant groups come in, they're often see different ways of doing things. They often will also learn different ways of doing things, and they'll bring ideas together, and there'll often be new innovations and new mixtures, and you could have entirely new cultures come about. And that's kind of the process of what's always happening everywhere around the world, is every place is kind of culturally and economically changing, and they're mixing with other cultures, and once that kind of happens and there's a kind of a status, you can have others come in, and it adds a lot of dynamicness to those areas, right? Oh, those are big open terms. All right, I'm running out of juice anyway. Well, today I'm gonna have you do some stuff in small groups. I'm gonna have you self-select groups of 7-ish. Just got a couple of questions about like migration histories and migration futures. But the same thing, we have one piece of paper with everyone there has their name on it. All right, see if you could self-assemble. Should be like 3 groups of 7-ish each. See what you can do. Actually, we've had a lot of people who aren't here today, so maybe 2 groups, 2 big groups. Can you form 2 large groups? So we got a lot of people who didn't come in today. Had a lot of emails. Yeah, 2 large groups. Yeah, sure. Yeah, move around. These are all on wheels. Allow people to merge. There you go. There you go. All right.
Should we just like go around in a circle and then answer the questions?
Someone write it down or
I'm gonna write it down. Or it's like, you should be the person or.
Rewriting this stuff.
Oh. Should we write down every person's answer?
You just want to pass around the paper.
It'll be simpler than you think because most people don't know.
Okay.
Oh.
So you go ahead.
Well, first game.
Who's up first, right? I like the club.
It's over at, Island. You're probably there.
Where's it?
Yeah. We have, I think, 8 ladies trying out. Are you serious? Yeah. Yeah, one of them plays juniors for some child, probably won't. Well, the Snoopy.
The bank? The bank?
They have Snoopy.
Is anyone from Montana State? You are, or you from?
I'm from Alaska.
This one. Here. Have you ever played this drink with Charles on Shoulder?
He's from Alaska.
What town is it in?
Is it like really cold?
It's right here.
Not where I am now. I'm in a temperate rainforest. And I'm right on the
Yeah, I
outside.
feel like a plane is a lot of drinks.
Yeah, I've done
I've done
it.
it a ton.
Oh, you went one point, so.
Our mosquitoes are awful in the summer.
I would say that depends on where, but I think that like in Fairbanks, they can be, yes.
Yeah.
Fairbanks is actually kind of like Minnesota. Fairbanks is here, so it's hot summer and really cold winter.
At least.
And bad mosquitoes.
So, temperatures.
Actually, yeah, it's actually colder here than where I'm
I'll
from.
just go for
Cause it's a yeah, cause I live in temperate rainforest right on the ocean. So hottest it gets is like 70, coldest it gets is 20.
That's not.
Yeah, so
It's
it's
cold in here.
Yeah. I think it's hotter here.
Yeah, you can. Alright, from here, state, Minnesota, my parents are from Cameroon. How far back do you get the church, I think? They moved here like 4 years before.
And then we went on,
So,
on right here, we'll just like talk about.
Yeah. I feel like 22. And then, yeah, what are your plans for, those, yeah, probably move after your graduation. Although, I thought you better stay up there.
Where do you wanna go? Just
Probably,
or see what
probably somewhere like Georgia or like
southern.
just like yeah.
What is like, what makes you wanna leave and what makes you wanna go there?
I don't know. It's hot. Well, I don't like the heat a lot, but it's better than the winter, so I say that.
Me and Casey wrote the, well, I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, and my parents came from Laos. They're immigrants, so that's just where my trace.
See, Texas moved to Minnesota. My parents also became a little.
Laos. Yeah, exactly. I heard on that.
When did you move here?
I thought it was more like school.
Seven.
Yeah.
I don't know how.
Wait, so you're from Madison, Wisconsin?
Yep.
I don't know how.
So like five.
Yeah, I thought about it, but I think I wanted to go out of state, to be honest. And I feel like Minnesota was far enough away where I can have the experience of being independent, but at the same time not too far from home. You know, it's only 4 hours.
My parents moved about 12 years.
Yeah.
It's like,
Sounds good.
And do you wanna stay here?
my buddy goes there.
Really?
Yeah, I went
You wanna
last
stay
year.
here? Yeah, I wanna stay here.
Mifflin?
Yeah.
Actually,
I haven't been, since Mifflin.
Yeah, it's
I want to.
just a big town
I
party.
think I might go this year. You know, Oktoberfest is tomorrow. in the
Oh,
house.
yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy. Really?
Okay,
Essentially the same thing as Mifflin, right? Or, yeah.
my whole life I've always lived in Minnesota for school, but like for the summer, I always lived in the
I heard there's like
any
a
break that's
in
in
where?
school.
Windsor? No, that's
So
crazy.
any,
go all around
any
the ice
break that you have in school,
On
I'm
a
just,
lake.
oh,
Yeah.
What?
There's like those two legs.
And then my family's from Mexico, my mom and my dad,
Go there and.
they're more than
It's on the lake.
Mexico.
I feel like someone would be dumb enough to like try to break the ice, like swim in the lake.
I would probably move back to
That ice
LA
is so thick.
after I
Yeah,
graduate.
Yeah.
But
like,
then
machinery to get
when
through.
I'm on
That's
campus,
weird.
I'd definitely get out of this
No
country.
food.
Like I go to Europe.
How long have your parents?
But yeah, I would recommend.
They've been with us like most
Like,
years.
like,
I think
it's fun, cause
my
like,
dad,
into the.
from his son I'm first gen, from my mom's side I'm
Yeah.
second gen.
Like, kind of just like talk to everyone.
Yeah, yeah.
And like, it's about, like,
Um,
And you said
you
you
don't wanna
wanted
go
to
out
move where?
Really?
To Los
there's
Angeles.
so many, like, instances where like out, and just like rip out.
Really?
All like the houses and everything,
Oh.
and like everybody's like, just pile people
For what?
up there. It's got, like,
The thing about it is like there's a bunch of people that
I
just
miss
like
my
fall.
family.
Yeah.
Most of my family lives
Apparently there's,
there.
like,
They live kind of a worse area though, which is why
What?
Like some people
they
like
don't
some,
consider me
like the
back
city will
there
call
unless it gets.
beforehand and like check it to make sure it's like.
Well, how do you like come to
There's
this?
something about things like.
I literally just ran on
Yeah.
site,
They were like,
it's expensive,
you
but
can't
like,
have like.
I go high and I want to be here,
Hey.
so I
The
get
closest
like
thing I've been to is Cato Jam.
and
Do you
I
have,
stay
like,
open.
Cato what?
Cato Jam or
Yeah,
Spatial.
my parents and I have like my mom's side is more here,
Oh.
it's more like my dad's side.
I went there last year. I just want to go there because you can just walk
Oh,
around. It's
when I was growing up, I
Yeah,
moved around
yeah,
a lot. I
that's
was
fun.
born here.
Yeah, it's like
And
literally.
then I moved to South Dakota, Wisconsin,
Yeah.
and then back here.
Open door.
My parents are from here, they're both raised in Minnesota. They just decided to travel with me, I guess. The only one I really know about is my grandfather, he immigrated from Mexico.
It's what?
The U-
Where, I don't know. It's like where in the general region.
Well, otherwise your family's like been in the US for a while.
Chill. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Then our homecoming is next week.
And then you wanna move or stay?
I kinda wanna go to Seattle.
What makes you wanna go to Seattle?
That is something.
That's what I'm saying. Remember last year?
Try it out.
That bit where you just transferred?
Yeah, but my friends will go here, so I was here for homecoming.
Oh, okay. So you're at that big Darby.
No.
No?
I went to a different Darby. My friend's hosting,
Let's see
when I
here.
first started.
Question.
I gotta get there.
Plus, I wasn't state.
My
My dad grew up in Alaska.
It was one of those like
My mom
backyards.
moved all over the place.
All together.
Don't ask me why. I don't know why. She was teaching before. She's like, I'm gonna go to Alaska now. Don't ask me why. I don't know why she did that.
There it is. It's still the same house.
Question.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it was-
Let's see. My,
If I'm not working, I think I'm.
Yeah.
the only thing I know is that, I don't know whether my mom's side, but I know on my dad's side, my great grandfather got to swing at 14,
Or I'm
sailed around the world, and then ended up in Alaska.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
So it's
Dude,
like-
I was like, I love sport, like.
I mean, I don't know. I haven't really got that far ahead yet, just trying to United States.
I went
Like,
back.
student life to get out.
Yeah.
So you like,
I went back
I wanna stay in Alaska?
I was bored.
Alaska, it's an interesting place with interesting challenges. There's probably other places that are better, there's probably other places that are worse. I really got that far ahead yet. That's a later me problem.
Back in the days.
I played in
I'm from Minnesota.
Really?
It's like I'd never been before.
Yeah, stayed in Minnesota my whole life.
I pulled up.
Parents lived in
Or
Minnesota.
like, I was like.
They lived in
I was like,
Wisconsin for
I couldn't do
like 10
anything.
years.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. That's why.
Just a tall body in the
Like,
course.
and then-
Yeah.
I don't really know about my mom's side that much, but my dad's side, I'm pretty sure my great grandparents.
Yeah, I got a couple good spots.
From
Yeah, that's
Germany.
so funny.
Post game was not too hot though.
You're from Minnesota then?
Yeah, just,
High school.
And, I like it here, I don't know if I, maybe if I got to stay with some job offers or something like that, maybe, but like if I was gonna start a family or something like that, probably move back.
Trinity.
Trinity.
Yeah, it's like a small.
So you like move for work when you're.
Yeah, just like out of college or something, maybe, just to,
Did you
just
guys
get a new
play
experience, but then probably move back here eventually.
Spectrum and
Yeah.
West Lutheran High School.
Yeah.
I actually used to live in Minnesota.
Okay,
Like
yeah.
until my sophomore, then we moved to Madison.
Okay.
So I went to West Lutheran,
Okay.
you know, so I do.
Yeah, yeah. Weird school.
Yeah.